Good morning. Thank you for joining us for our LinkedIn Live session today. My name is Mary Ann Sieghart, and I am the Managing Director at Women of Influence Plus. Thank you for being here. Before I introduce today's speaker, I would just like to share one short housekeeping note for all of our viewers joining us today. Please do share your questions in the comment section. Our team member, Rachel, will be moderating this discussion, and we will get to as many of your questions as possible. All right. Well, today we are joined by Mary Ann Sieghart, bestselling author of The Authority Gap and founding partner of the Authority Gap Consultancy. We are examining the biases that still shape how women's experience is perceived. Mary Ann, good morning.
Good morning, Maricel. How are you today?
Oh, living the dream. Thank you so much for joining us today. Mary Ann, I wanted to start off with something we chatted about just a few minutes ago. You've personally experienced this. After sharing many of your accomplishments, a man once responded by calling you a busy little girl. Can you tell us a little bit about this moment and how it relates to your work in the Authority Gap?
It was extraordinary, really. I was at this big conference, and at dinner, I was sat next to a man I hadn't talked to during the course of the day. And he asked me what I did, and I led a portfolio life. And I genuinely didn't know which of my portfolio jobs he'd be most interested in. So I told him, I sat on this board and that board and made radio programs and wrote a column in a newspaper and all this sort of thing. At the end of which he said, "Wow, you're a busy little girl." And I was about 50. I was older than our then Prime Minister, and I was being called not just a girl, which is annoying enough, but a little girl. And it's just a classic example of the authority gap, how women are disrespected and undermined and underestimated, and in this case, literally infantilized. I was being compared with a 5-year-old child, in effect. Amazing.
I'm sure that's something many of our viewers and I myself have experienced. Could we get right into your work on the authority gap? How do you define it? Why does it still show up so persistently across workplaces, politics, and everyday interactions?
Yeah. So the authority gap is a measure of how much more seriously we still take men than women. So we assume a man knows what he's talking about until he proves otherwise, whereas for a woman, it's all too often the other way around. And women are twice as likely as men to say they have to provide evidence of their competence, or that people are often surprised at their abilities. And women of color are twice as likely as white people to say these things. So basically, the further you are from the white male middle class default, the wider the authority gap becomes. And what happens as a result of the authority gap is that we are not accorded as much authority as men. And as a result, we are often underestimated, patronized, like in that case. We are interrupted or talked over in meetings. We find it much harder to influence a group of people, women as well as men, by the way, because women do this too. If we have expertise, it's more likely to be challenged and questioned. And if we're in a position of authority, people are more likely to resist it, particularly men. Why is it still happening now? I think because nobody has really called it out properly until now. And so the emphasis has always been on representation, which is a great thing. Why aren't there more women in senior positions in your organization? Why is society still basically run by men? And that is very important. But what I'm saying is that it's not enough to start promoting more women to senior positions if the culture in which they work is still undervaluing them and undermining them, and they're not taken as seriously as their male colleagues.
Ray, could you walk us through, sorry, Mary Ann, could you walk us through a few examples of how a woman might experience the authority gap and how she might handle this in the moment?
Yeah, so being interrupted or talked over is a classic one. And though it sounds quite trivial, it is actually quite serious, because if it's happening in a meeting, it's very humiliating for the person being interrupted, because what it suggests is, A, that what the man, because it probably is a man, has to say is more important and more interesting than what you've got to say, and it is literally silencing you. So it is a very annoying thing to happen to you, and it happens to women at the most senior levels in society. So there was a fascinating study done of US Supreme Court proceedings. And you don't get much more authoritative than being a US Supreme Court justice. And what the researchers found was that the female justices were interrupted 3 times more than the male ones, 96% of the time by men. So even being Ruth Bader Ginsburg doesn't insulate you from the authority gap. Now, what can you do when this sort of thing happens? Well, the trouble is that every time a woman complains about this behavior happening to her, she's likely to be labeled difficult, prickly, oversensitive. You sort of get gaslighted about it. And so what's much better is for whoever is running the meeting to say, hang on a minute, I was really interested in what Marisol was saying there. Could you let her finish, please? Or indeed for another colleague at the meeting to do the same. So it's much easier as a woman to recruit allies than to take the risk and complain yourself. But I mean, I will say, hang on a minute, I haven't finished yet. But I know that if you're more junior, it can be a bit more awkward.
And Mary Ann, what is the impact of experiencing this to women in the workplace, women in leadership positions, but also to organizations when this goes left unchecked?
Yeah. Well, one of the things that my consultancy does in organizations is we always start off by me giving a keynote talk or this sort of presentation, a fireside chat, in order just to spread awareness about what it is in the first place. Because then, to your question earlier about what a woman can do, once the authority gap is a topic of conversation in the company, then you can easily say, oh, I think that was a bit of an authority gap moment. And that's a really useful phrase to use because you're talking about the moment rather than the perpetrator. So it doesn't become too personal. It's quite neutral. It's not very charged. And then it enables people to discuss the moment. And maybe for the perpetrator to say, oh gosh, I'm sorry. Yes, I was a bit impatient. I interrupted you. I'm really sorry. I won't do it again. But then the perpetrator doesn't feel sort of got at in the same way. Now, how does it damage women? Well, each individual instance of the authority gap may seem quite small, but they compound like compound interest. They roll up over the course of a working life to create this immense gap in achievement and opportunity between women and men. And we see this in almost every organization. You get roughly 50-50 women and men at entry level, and at every single level above that, men tend to get promoted faster than women, so that by the time you get to the C-suite or even just to the exco, it's much more likely to be 60, 70, 75% male, 2 to 3 times as many men as women. And this happens because there was a fascinating study done of Walmart to look at, and they looked at performance evaluations and promotions over many years. So they were able to track progress. And they found that women actually got slightly better performance evaluations than men on average, but they were 14% less likely to be promoted. And that's because they're being undervalued, because promotion was decided on potential. And I'm using air quotes because potential is such a subjective thing, isn't it? And so they were assuming that these men had more potential than the women. Though actually, because it was a longitudinal analysis, they saw the women did have as much potential as the men in the end, but they weren't being promoted as fast. And we see this in corporate America. McKinsey and Lean In do an annual Women at Work survey, and they find that even on the very first rung of the managerial ladder, 100 men are promoted for every 81 women. And that figure of 81 has actually gone down over the last year. So women are entering the workforce with better educational qualifications on average than men, but they're not being promoted. And that's because of the authority gap, because they're just not perceived as competent as men are.
Why is that, Mary Ann?
Well, I mean, we've all grown up in a world in which it is much easier to associate male with authority than female, because men have broadly been in charge and broadly still are in most sectors of society. And most of us have grown up in a family in which our father probably worked more than our mother and almost certainly earned more than our mother, and may have had more authority at home as well than our mother, though, of course, that varies from family to family. And so our brains get hardwired to think manager, think male. And it's very hard to notice your bias. We all have this unconscious bias, women as well as men. A lot of the studies have found the women having it too. But and because it's called unconscious for a reason, we don't do it on purpose, but it's because of the way our brains have been hardwired since childhood. But what we can't do is put a lid on it or stop it happening. But what we can do is start to notice when it manifests itself and then correct for it. And so, I mean, I have it myself, and I've written a book about it. But I mean, I find if I hear a woman with quite a high voice, for instance, being interviewed on the radio in the morning, my reflex reaction will often be not to take her seriously because she sounds a bit childish. She sounds like she doesn't know what she's talking about. But as soon as I notice that reflex reaction, I will immediately say to myself, stop it, listen to the content of what she's saying, and don't judge her by the pitch of her voice. But if we're not aware enough, we don't correct for this bias. So it is really important to be aware of how your brain is basically trying to play tricks on you.
Mary Ann, that actually brings me to one of the questions I had planned for us today, and that's the common belief that bias is a thing of the past, something because of all the efforts put into DEI that we are solving for, and we're making some great movement. But that talent and expertise should speak for themselves. But your work reveals that even the most accomplished women are routinely underestimated. So what's actually at play here?
It is bias. We haven't got rid of bias. I mean, we'd love to get rid of bias, but it'll probably take about a century. That's why I'm saying, we can't put a lid on it. We just need to notice it more. We need to be more aware of it. And what really annoys me is this argument that DEI is somehow the enemy of meritocracy. It's exactly the opposite. It's because we don't have a genuine meritocracy now that we need to try to correct for the biases that lie in the way of a genuine meritocracy. So if women are 14% less likely to be promoted than men, even if their performance evaluations are better, we don't have a meritocracy, do we? And if you look, there's been some fascinating studies on adjectives used in performance appraisals. And of course, performance appraisals lie at the root of whether you get promoted or hired or get a better bonus or a pay rise. And what it found was that women are 10 times more likely than men to be described as abrasive. Now, that's because when a woman starts acting as confidently or as assertively as a man, we quite often call her abrasive or strident or aggressive, words that are never used of a man, showing exactly the same character traits. Women are 7 times more likely than men to be described as opinionated. Now, men have opinions, but women are opinionated. Of course, that's very derogatory, isn't it? Men are twice as likely as women to be described as intelligent. And yet we all know that the IQ curve for women and men is identical, except at the very, very far ends of the bell curve. Men are 3 times more likely to be described as brilliant and twice as likely to be described as talented. Now, do we really believe that men are twice as intelligent, twice as talented, and 3 times as brilliant as women? No. So there must be a bias at play.
Sorry to interrupt you, Mary Ann. You just got I'm very opinionated at the moment. We shared an article last week that posits that we need to change how we view leadership. We need to expand our definition of leadership and to include how women lead, because it's very obvious that women lead differently, but that is the point. So how does this change our desire to change our paradigms regarding what leadership is impact the authority gap? They seem to go hand in hand, at least from my perspective.
Yeah. I think we have already changed our paradigms of leadership to some extent. So, for instance, people who write about management and leadership say that transformational leadership, as they call it, is the most effective form of leadership. And that is a type of leadership which is more democratic, collaborative, more engaging of employees, more inspirational. And as it turns out, women on average are slightly better at being transformational leaders than men. I mean, I'm sure there are some terrific male transformational leaders too, but nonetheless, this is the best form of leadership and women are slightly better at it. So that's already being recognized. I think we could do more though, by the way. So, there's a brilliant book, I don't know if you've read, called Why Do So Many Incompetent Men Become Leaders by Thomas Chamorro-Premuzic. He's an organizational psychologist, and he says that the very characteristics that lead us to promote people are the same characteristics that make them bad leaders when they get to the top. So overconfidence, charisma, or so-called charisma, being on transmit rather than receive. These are all characteristics which, in a job interview, you're very self-promoting and you tell the interview panel how brilliant you are and you don't have any doubts about yourself. They think, oh, he really knows what he's talking about. He's going to be really good. Actually, he's probably going to be quite a bad manager or leader, because the better leaders have a more accurate estimation of what they can do, are more likely to delegate to others, and more likely to listen to others, and more likely to take constructive feedback from others. That sort of man isn't.
Mm-hmm. Mary Ann, actually, this brings me to an interesting piece in your work. People who have experienced life as both a man and a woman offer a unique perspective on how gender shapes credibility and influence. So, what insights did they share about these differences during your research?
This is so interesting because normally, if you are a woman up against a man for a promotion or for a job and he gets it and you don't, you might suspect that bias was at play or the authority gap played a part, but it's terribly hard to prove because you're different people and he might genuinely be better and more deserving of that job than you. But if you talk to somebody who has lived as both a man and a woman, then you're talking to the same person and they've got the same ability, intelligence, character, experience. And if they are treated quite differently after they transition, that must be because of their gender. So, as scientists would say, you've controlled for all the other variables and you've isolated the only one that matters, which is whether they are seen as male or female. And sure enough, I tell the story in my book of two Stanford science professors who happened to transition in different directions at the same time. They used to meet up for lunch, compare notes. And Ben Barres, who was a neuroscientist, said after he started living as a man, I've had the thought a million times, I'm just taken more seriously now. He said, my work is taken more seriously. The same damned work, he said, is taken more seriously now that people see me as a man. And an academic who didn't know his history was overheard after one of his seminars saying, oh, Ben Barres gave a great seminar today, but then his work's much better than his sister's, i.e., his own. And meanwhile, Joan Roughgarden, who's an evolutionary biologist, she told me that when she was still living as a man, she felt like she was just on this conveyor belt to success, and she kept getting promoted. Her pay kept getting increased. She was asked to sit on all these important committees. She found it very easy to get research grants. And once she started living as a woman, all that changed, and she was treated with such disrespect, all this sort of authority gap behavior that I've been talking about. And she found, she was talked over in meetings. No one listened to her unless a man repeated her point and then he got all the credit. She said she got personally attacked. People would say things to her like, well, you clearly haven't read the literature. She said that never happened to me when I was living as a man. And at first she said I was amused. I thought, well, if I'm going to live as a woman, I'm darn well going to be discriminated against like a woman. And then she said, well, the thrill of that has worn off, I can tell you. And her conclusion, similar to mine, is that men are assumed to be competent until they prove otherwise. Women are assumed to be incompetent until they prove otherwise. And actually, this may sound anecdotal, just a story of two people, but much bigger studies have been done of trans people finding exactly the same phenomena. Trans men say, I'm so much more respected now. When I talk, people listen, they want to know my opinion. I can get away with so much more. Their pay tends to rise faster. Trans women finding exactly the opposite. And of course, having lived as men before and not understanding or experiencing sexism, once they start living as a woman, they say, I had no idea of the extent of it until I was at the wrong end of it.
It's incredible. Those are incredible examples and are clear proof points that the authority gap exists and persists. Now, how do we speak to the other side of the proverbial room and share with men the responsibility of fixing this? Because I loved in your TED talk how it is not up to women to fix this. It is something that is systemic and something that we need to attack at all angles.
Mm. It is really important to involve men in this. And in our consultancy, we always say this, we're not here to fix the women, we're here to fix the culture. And that crucially means involving the men, because there's been some fascinating BCG research showing that in businesses where men are involved in gender equality, 96% report progress, compared with only 30% when men aren't involved. So it's crucial that men join this conversation, but it's also in their interests to join the conversation. And a lot of them think, oh, all this women stuff, let the women deal with it. I'm going to go on and run the business and make money. And what we're saying is, you will make more money. You will improve the performance of your business if you manage to narrow your authority gap. Because at the moment, your women are going to be less engaged because of the way they're treated at work, more likely to quit. That's very expensive. They're going to be working less hard and contributing less in meetings if they're not really being listened to. All these things are actually affecting your performance in a bad way. If you're only making the most of half of your workforce, you're not maximizing the potential of your business. So we say to men, look, we can teach you how to be better leaders, better managers, and how to get more out of your teams. And as a result, your team will perform better and you will be recognized for that. So it's very much in men's interest too at work. It's also very much in men's interests at home. In fact, there's been fascinating research showing that in more gender equal both societies and straight relationships in which the mother and the father share the chores pretty equally and the childcare pretty equally, not only are the women much happier and healthier and they feel less resentful, less exhausted, less burdened, more part of a team, and the children also are happier and healthier, get on much better with their dads, do better at school. Boys are less likely to get into trouble. Girls are more likely to be ambitious for themselves. But crucially, the men themselves are much happier and healthier in these relationships. So they're twice as likely to say they're satisfied with their lives. I mean, that's a huge statistical difference. Less than half as likely to be depressed, much less likely to get divorced. They tend to smoke less, drink less, take fewer drugs, they get more sleep at night. And here is the absolute clincher, they get more frequent and better sex. So guys, it's really in your interest, okay? I
I
want to
mean, the
say,
data is.
can I put on the cover how to get more sex so I'll get more momentum?
I'd be interested to see how those book sales do.
Me too.
Mary Ann, the data is clear. I mean, you have listed data that supports that this is not just good for home life, it's good for personal well-being, it's good for the business's bottom line. So where are the tension points, despite the fact that numbers support this?
Okay, so one big tension point is coming across from the US, not so much a headwind as a hurricane. And a lot of our clients are saying, "Oh, I'm not sure about this. We don't want to do anything that smacks of DEI." And we say, "Look, actually, it's not about DEI. It's about improving your performance, and it's about improving your talent management." So that's how you should dress it up. If you want to perform better as a business, this is very much in your interests. But of course, we do have this DEI problem coming from the marvelous President Trump. Uh, and otherwise, I think, there are some male leaders who find it uncomfortable and they think they're somehow being blamed, shamed, criticized, got at. And we always say, when we conduct our training and workshop sessions, we say, look, we're absolutely not here to blame or shame or criticize or get at anybody. Everybody does this. Women do it as well as men. We've all had it hardwired into our brains. We can all change. We can actually just change tomorrow if we want to. And it's not really rocket science either. It's quite easy to change these habits. But it's not a man. And I actually say in my book, this is not a man bashing book. But if men don't join the conversation, they're not going to be able to change.
Absolutely. And Mary Ann, could you speak to how you work with organizations and even individuals on how to remove the blame from the conversation, the shame that may be associated with it, so we can actually have collaborative conversations about this that move the needle forward?
Yes. Well, I think talking about authority gap moments when they occur. So, I think I was saying earlier, if you get interrupted in a meeting or something, point to the moment rather than the person. That really takes the pressure out of it. We find that a very good way of engaging men is via their hearts as well as their heads. And in fact, the research shows that that's the best way to mitigate bias, is to try to engender empathy with what sociologists call the out group, in this case, women. And so what we do is we talk to women in an organization and we just ask them for anecdotal experiences of how they've encountered the authority gap there. And of course, we anonymize the stories. And then we ask men to read them out one at a time. We'll put one in each envelope, just a very short story and one line on how it made the woman feel. And then the man will stand up and read what's in the envelope in front of him. And of course, it's in the first person, which helps. And he'll have to read out something like, I was in a meeting last week on a subject I knew quite a lot about, and I kept making these suggestions, and none of my male colleagues took any notice until one of them repeated the suggestion, and he got all the credit for it. It made me feel belittled and humiliated and made me wonder, why am I working for this company? Now, that's very powerful. And then, I or the trainer can say to the man, gosh, how do you think you'd feel if that happened to you? And of course, he'll say, well, I'd be really annoyed. It'd be really frustrating. No, of course, that's very annoying. But quite often they say at the beginning, but that sort of thing doesn't happen here. We're not that sort of company. And then, of course, I can say, well, it did happen here. And I'm sure you weren't one of those men in the room, but it did happen to one of your female colleagues. And then and then we can explain why it's so much harder for men to notice this behavior than it is for women, because after all, they're not at the wrong end of it. And a lot of men have said to me afterwards, I had no idea about the authority gap. I'd never noticed it happening. Now I see it everywhere. And once their eyes are opened and they see it, they can do something about it so easily. So, suppose you were the woman who had made that point at a meeting and no one had taken any notice, and then John repeats it 10 minutes later and gets all the credit, then one of these men can say, "Oh, I'm so glad you agree with what Maricel said earlier." You know, you can call it out in a nice, gentle, slightly humorous way, but it does make people think about doing that next time.
Absolutely. And what it sounds like, it's just about creating awareness with all those involved. So not just around women who are experiencing it. It's important for women, of course, because we need to name the experience.
Mm.
So many women will respond to some of our content and say, I didn't know there was a name for that, whether it be the authority gap or even tall poppy syndrome. But
Yeah.
once we name it, we can solve for it. So what if, let's say, your organization is not currently doing work on the authority gap or to address it? What are some ways that we can introduce this awareness in our workplaces?
Well, I think, obviously I can come in and help, but, get people to watch my TED talk, get them to read the book if possible, make them aware of what we call micro boosts, which are what men tend to receive much more than women. And again, it's as a result of unconscious, in this case, affinity bias. What will happen is that a male manager will need a more junior member of his team to help him with a pitch document, say, and then to go and pitch to the client. And he'll just choose someone who reminds him of himself 20 years ago. He'll choose a mini me, and he'll do it without realizing it. He's not actively discriminating against the young woman on his team. But, the mini me, Michael, say, gets to help with a pitch, gets to help with a brief. And then, of course, when performance appraisal comes around, the annual appraisal, Michael can say, well, I helped deliver all this revenue. I worked on this big pitch. And of course, Mary Ann didn't. And so Michael gets promoted or gets a bigger bonus or gets a pay rise and she doesn't. And it's not her fault. It's because he keeps getting these micro boosts that she doesn't get. And again, getting managers to be more aware of how they distribute these micro boosts more equitably around their team can be really helpful. These are the sort of things that organizations need to talk about and
Absolutely.
measure.
Mary Ann, we have a question from the audience. What can we do to prioritize women in leadership roles?
Well, I think we can point to research that shows that women are very good leaders to start with. So there was one big piece of research showing that subordinates rated female leaders to be better than male leaders. Though in the same piece of research, the male leaders rated themselves more highly than the women did, which I thought was interesting. I think probably one quick way to get women promoted more is for everybody to stop mistaking confidence for competence, because they're absolutely not the same thing. And women are socialized to be much less confident than men. So boys are socialized to be more confident than girls. The way they're treated at school, the way they're treated by each other, by their parents, all these things coalesce to make, and also they're allowed to be more confident and self-promoting than girls. If girls behave the way boys do, they will be ostracized immediately, both by their peer group and by the adults around them. I mean, I remember my parents saying, nobody likes a boastful girl. They never said that to my brother, right? And so if you take a man at his word, he's much more likely to be either accurate or overconfident of his abilities than a woman is. So if you simply take him at his word, you're more likely to promote him. Okay. If he says, oh, I've done so well this year in a self-evaluation, say, if appraisals include self-evaluation, then men are much more likely to big themselves up than women are, because we have been taught from birth almost not to promote ourselves. Nobody likes a boastful girl, right? And so we will either be accurate or modest about our achievements. And men are much more likely to be overconfident. And if you reward that, then you're not promoting the right people. So you absolutely have to look at genuine competence and achievement, not at what people say they have done or can do.
Mhm. Mary Ann, we are almost at time, but I do have one more question for you. If the authority gap disappeared tomorrow, what would change in our workplaces? What does a world look like when women's expertise is valued and taken as seriously as men's?
They will be much happier, much more successful workplaces. The more women you have in a group, the bigger the group's intelligence is not because the women themselves are more intelligent, but you make better decisions when you have more women in a group. And that's true of a workplace too. And if women's potential is being fully maximized, which is what will happen if the authority gap disappears, you'll just get a better quality of leadership in your organization. It would be fantastic.
Well, let's hope that we will see that world in our lifetime, or at least a glimpse of it, Mary Ann. Do you have any last pieces of advice or guidance before we end our LinkedIn Live today?
Oh, goodness. Yes, I would say representation isn't enough. You really need to look at how people are treated in the workplace as well as how fast they're being promoted. So it's all about culture change, is what I would say. And may take a little bit of time, but the more awareness we have of the authority gap, the easier it is to change behaviors and attitudes. And I really genuinely think it can be done. So let's all try. Let's get started.
Yes, indeed. Let's get started. And what a week for us to do this with International Women's Day coming up.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much, Mary Ann, for taking the time to chat with us today. And to our live audience, thank you as always for joining us. Many of you have asked if this will be available for replay, and yes, you can find it on our LinkedIn page. We will also put a link to Mary Ann's best-selling book, The Authority Gap, in the comments section, so be sure to pick up a copy and read more about Mary Ann's important work. Thank you so much.
If you go to theauthoritygap.com, you can find out about the work we're doing as well, consultancy.
Wonderful. And that's theauthoritygap.com. We will also include that in the comments section. Thank you, everyone. We'll see you soon. Take care.
Bye.